We're reading Gods of the Upper Air now. We're going back and forth. So we read chapter 1 of the textbook through the lens of cultural anthropology. We will now do a couple chapters out of Gods of the Upper Air. And then on Thursday, we go back into the textbook. So I've tried to bounce these things off of each other in a way that will sometimes hopefully make sense. Some of the people you read about in one place will show up in the other place. And in this case, just to kind of preview where we're going, we did something about what is cultural anthropology, and we did some things about, the idea of culture and where it came from. But we read more about the historical context of that in this book, which the library tells me is now on closed reserve. So if you want to go read it for 2 hours when you hand in your ID card in the library, you can, I think, get it there. I don't know if they have I think they've ordered the textbook, but I didn't see it in yet. The cultural anthropology, they have another one that's just not, it's general anthropology that will be similar but not the same. Anyway, from here we go back into the next chapter is called Studying Contemporary Culture, and when we get through Boas on Baffin Island and how he's trying to write down all these things and stuff, that will help us to understand how anthropologists started doing this thing we call field work and ethnography. Boas was perhaps one of the inventors of it. But I want to start back in the historical context because I think some of you were struck by how things were quite different back then when the anthropologists were coming out with their ideas. The whole society wasn't the same. Now, sometimes I think the more things change, the more they remain the same, but there are other things that seem just totally mind-blowingly different. So it's good to kind of get a sense of what people were up against when they first came out with these ideas that today might seem common sense, back in the day would have seemed very strange. Now, some of you said that you thought that this was a pretty good read or an interesting read, but there were some confusing paragraphs. You never told me what the confusing paragraphs were. So as we're going through it, if you chance upon them and you say, hey, that's a confusing paragraph, let me know. Otherwise, we're just going to cruise along and hope. So things were different. I want to start back in 1577 and kind of a little bit further on into the book with Mickey's. You were kind of struck by this little thing that went on there. What happened?
You guys have names, but
now you're in a zoo. Yeah, they grabbed some people. One of them was too old to run away. The other has a little kid, so couldn't run away. And they just took them. We took. And they brought them back. There were some Inuit. They brought them back to wherever they were, England, I guess. That's usually where they bring people. They bring people to various places. Well, I think they already had those names, and they started using their names. Well, at least they told people who they were instead of just a general name. So you said that was progress of a sort. So yeah, it's a little different. I mean, we shouldn't be able to do that today. 1577, so that's, I guess what I want to say about this is, for one thing, this is happening long before there was ever anything called anthropology. Long before people talked about these things. So when we're talking about, say, Boas, we're talking about 1890s, like 300 years after this. So this is a long time ago, but it's important to know that this was the colonial context of the time, which set up the conditions for anthropology. This is what Europeans sometimes did, was go in and take people away and just take them. And so anthropologists sometimes, as we'll read, did some similar things, which were bad. But they didn't invent this tradition. It was already there. And so a lot of the ideas that people had, like some people get down on anthropology because they're like, well, you did this and you did that, which is true, and they should be called into account for the bad things they participated in. But the general context was already there. It was already invented. People were doing bad stuff before then. So that's a while ago. I guess I would also say we shouldn't necessarily close our eyes to the fact that people still get moved around against their will in our society. We usually try not to keep them in zoos. We usually don't see them when they get moved around. We keep them in prison or in immigration centers and stuff like that. And so they're shielded from view. But this stuff still does happen. So we shouldn't congratulate ourselves too much for getting over this. But yes, things perhaps were a little bit different back then. And then I guess I also want to, this is something that Taylor, you talked about, was the census and these censuses that people, so now I'm fast forwarding up to the time of, say, around when anthropology is coming out. But again, just to get a sense of like what was happening at this time. So Taylor, tell us about these censuses. What was that like?
I thought that was interesting. So like I have to look at like the census a lot and look at all the like websites. So I was a little bit interested in that and how they were categorizing different types of people based on their economic status, like family status, or race or anything. They were just separated like so much.
In the United States, the census has been very linked to the question of race from the beginning. And in fact, it's still the question that we all have to answer on the census. We don't actually have to give you your social class, but we do have to check off a box for race. Now, what's perhaps different is in the 1890s, as Charles King says here on page 5, not only did they divide people into types, but there were census takers who went around and checked off the box for you by looking at you or asking you, but they checked the box off. So it was usually white men who would go around and take the census. So later on nowadays, it's self-reporting. We're still supposed to check a box. In the year 2000, I think King writes this, in the year 2000 was the first year that you could check more than one box or write your own thing in. But up until then, you had to choose one box. We'll be talking about the census and the ways in which people sort things into race as we go along. But I thought these pages, obviously some of the stuff that was happening in 1577 was way different, but certainly the stuff from page 4 to page 8 or so of the things that everybody or every educated person were said to believe. And so what King does is tell us that these early anthropologists, the people who ended up gathered around Boas, were, well, let me read what he says. Page 4. This book is about women and men who found themselves on the front lines of the greatest moral battle of our time. The greatest moral battle of our time, which is a pretty heady thing to be in on. So Seth, what would you say that battle was? Like, what what were people trying to argue for here, argue against? Ah, yeah, I'm kind of pushing what you wrote. You wrote about how people were trying to figure out who the science was trying to figure out what kind of people were. Now you're tuning in. Yeah.
I don't like that specific answer. I don't know how to explain it, like how you're trying, but can you repeat the question?
So let's start with, what did people think they were doing with science? That's what you actually wrote about. What did they think their objective was, and when they were looking at humanity and trying to use science there? I think you were on page 7, actually.
Yeah. Oh, basically trying to pit them one against each other and see who's smarter, who overall is better. And then, after doing that, they determine that there is no one superior group than one another or whatever. That's kind of what I talked about.
Right. So the idea was that there were some individuals and groups who were naturally, this is on page 7, which is what you actually talked about, which was naturally smarter, abler, more upstanding, and fitter to rule. The people who should be in charge. And that science would tell you that, and that other people should kind of, be ruled over or maybe even disappear. They shouldn't count for so much, right? And that was the idea, and everybody thought that that's what was going on. And so what is this greatest moral battle of our time? The struggle to prove that, despite differences of skin color, gender, ability, or custom, humanity is one undivided thing. And you don't want to count people out too soon, because the people who might look different from you or do things a little different from you might have some really great ideas about how to move us all in a better direction than we are. So this is kind of, I hope, one of the things I like about Charles King is that as an outsider, he is better able sometimes to see the scope of what this whole thing was about. This is a slide from the last class, which may be in your notes, when I argued that cultural anthropology may be in a better position when it was fighting people from the outsider position, when it was fighting against ethnocentrism, racism, gender stereotypes, all of these things. And that as anthropology becomes more established and joins the academy and becomes one of those upstanding people in society, that it kind of loses some of that edge that it had before. And I think that's kind of true of people in anthropology like me. When I first read Charles King's book, it made me mad because I'm like, I knew that. I teach that kind of stuff. And here's a person, I think his degree is in political science or international relations. Here's a person who isn't even an anthropologist telling me what's important about this. But I think that that's sort of critical to this, that he has an outsider perspective on how this mattered to society, and not just to the people within anthropology or the ones who are trying to learn things in a classroom. How does it matter out there? So that's why I enjoy, or I am so far enjoying pairing this book, because we kind of get a sense of what are the stakes? What is the bigger picture of this enterprise outside of what we're learning in college, or what we're supposed to memorize all those terms for? So what King says here is that the argument eventually becomes about this idea, which we've seen before, the idea of culture. Felicia, what did you get out of this culture thing on page 9? What's the deal with culture here?
Boas said that culture, because of how to proud, as a leader, and it's just interesting to me that culture is in languages, symbols, values, norms.
Tells us how to raise a child, how to pick a leader, how to find good things to eat, how to marry well, right? And so it ends up defining all kinds of things that we consider good, right, upstanding, all these things. And in some ways, this is probably for many of us seems like, yeah, right, of course. But at the time, it did not. At the time, this was a crazy idea. People thought that those things were rooted in nature, biology, God, whatever you might take into account. And so, if you remember what we talked about in culture on page 5 of Gonzalez's textbook, the idea, this laundry list idea that culture includes all these things, the crucial thing that Boas and his circle did is to take that laundry list. Okay, if culture is all this stuff that we learn, we're then going to use it to attack the idea that people are determined by their race or their racial abilities. In fact, Juliana, how should we think about race? What did they try to convince people to think about race at all?
Are you saying like that we should like break the human with a social reality, not like a biological reality?
Social reality and not a biological reality. So something that exists because we make it up and because we socially impose it. We'll go into this a lot, don't worry. But in some ways is not a clear-cut biological division in the way that it's been portrayed. And so wanted us to think about race in a different way, and that let me put something else up here, and that in some ways would go against this, again, what we talked about in the last class, this idea that Lewis Henry Morgan, also an American anthropologist, had been expressing, codifying, putting out there that everybody passed through these stages from the savage to the barbarism to the civilized, that we're all on this one line. And so I think if you keep going on page 9, after the passage that Felicia was talking about, the implications of the idea that we make our own agreed upon truths were profound, so that we ourselves create our own culture. It undermined the claim that social development is linear, running from allegedly primitive societies to so-called civilized ones. Oh, there's my graph. So culture, according to King here, is undermining the claim that social development is linear, going from primitive to civilized. It called into question some of the building blocks of political and social order, from the belief in the obviousness of race to the conviction that gender and sex are simply the same thing. And we'll be talking a lot more about race in the next few weeks, and we'll be talking about gender and sex after that in part 2 a lot more. We got a little bit of a taste, Brady, we got a little bit of a taste of Margaret Mead out there talking about those adolescents. What did you get out of that? And that they didn't have any, what happens in other societies with their adolescents?
I talked about how and how there was little rebellious personas amongst those people because it's so easygoing and not constricting.
Yeah, so we had in our society, we still have this, that teenagers are naturally rebellious and they're supposed to break the norms of our parents, especially around the ideas of sex. And so we'd have this idea that everybody goes through these stages of life. Probably still have some of that idea. But, well, again, we'll be talking about this much more later on. Margaret Mead comes in and she goes to another society. It's not necessarily that they were You know, it's not that they didn't have norms, but that people didn't feel like they had to rebel against those norms in order to establish themselves. That in some ways, at least when it came to sexuality, they were much more easygoing. And so, as you put it, there was little to rebel against. You didn't have to become a rebel when you were a teenager, because why? You just agreed with people. So again, this undermined the idea that the stages of life were underwritten by some sort of predetermined biology, by divine will, that they were the same all over the world, and would cause the idea that what changes is, or what is different about different societies, the reason we know they're different is because of their culture. Now, a little bit more in this chapter. Francis, you were struck by this the great-grandchildren part. Why? Oh, okay. So you've personally experienced this, right? All right. So here King says that, old ways of doing things have passed away. Ours will too someday. Our great-grandchildren will wonder how we ever could have believed and behaved as we do. They will marvel at our ignorance and fault our moral judgment. That is why culture only makes sense in the plural. So it makes sense that there's all these kinds of different cultures, and that in some ways we're getting introduced here to the idea that it's also always changing. It's not the same even for others. And in fact, in our own society, our great-grandchildren will think that we were ignorant. Now, I guess the one thing that I would say about that is that sometimes if we think that, well, what does that make you think? If you think about you're not old enough to have great-grandchildren. Maybe I should have great-grandchildren. What does that make you think about the world? What's it going to be like for great-grandchildren? What will they look back at my generation and say? Yeah. How did you survive without cell phones? Will they even have cell phones then? Is that going to be forever? Great-grandchildren? Think about this. How long will that be? Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren.
You can do like you start cars, except if you're driving yourself. You have to drive yourself, you have to learn to drive, you have to get in that passenger seat and learn to drive. What's a stick? Right?
What's a stick? Yeah, we're passing out of that era, I think. You hope not. I guess I'm thinking more in terms of ideas about morality and who belongs in the world, those kinds of things.
Our generation, that's good. I would say. Yeah, we're not all the way there because we are third, fourth generation that's lived in this country. Are we? Yeah, and that was only 100 years ago. The person lived at 8 years old. Yeah,
All right, hang on. Let me think about this for a second. Yeah, you're thinking way too hard. Give me one thing that your generation has done. What's the one thing your generation has done? What? Huh? Criticisms? Give me something that seems totally natural in your generation that you look back to your grandparents or great-grandparents and you're like, how could you think that?
Interracial marriage. How about that? Accepting people for who they are.
Like it's that kind of concept. We're not all there, but we're making steps.
I think I would say that your generation. I would say that with same-sex marriage, that's been an innovation of almost an innovation of your generation. I'm not sure about that. Like, it's just considered to be like completely fine. Right? Yeah, you can take that for most. Yeah. I guess the reason I'm bringing this up is because I want to be clear that if you sort of go over to the next page, that we have to realize this about our own society as well as others. As this was sort of an insight from Boas and his circle, that history moves in loops and circles, not in straight lines and toward no particular end. Is to say the things that our great-grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, might think were dumb about me may not be the things that I wanted them to think were dumb about me. That is to say, let's just think about what's been happening on the Supreme Court recently. Right? So, if you think back, and actually it's in this book, some of the things the Supreme Court decided, like that same-sex marriage is A-okay, or like that we have a right to contraception, or that interracial marriage is A-okay. Well, recently, a decent number of those things have been called into question. Certain rights that people assumed they had for the last 50 years, bodily autonomy and being able to decide what to do about their own reproductive freedoms, taken out. Which is to say that history does not move in a straight line, can circle back and go the other way, or not the way that you thought it was going to go to. So I guess I would just caution us to not think that everything's just going to get better and better. Maybe we do need those stick shift cars. All right. Let's go into the second chapter here. Nick, what do we learn about Franz Boas?
Childhood, where he was raised, kind of what he learned, and then I mentioned how the bigger book was Boasians himself, and it kind of almost set him on his journey for all the expeditions and this exploration.
You like that book?
I've never read it, but I've heard it.
I'm right there with you. There was some famous book there. Yeah. No, it was fun. For me, it was fun. I never learned about childhood of young Franz and got some particulars there. I guess I would say it was interesting that some of these people that are revered to be all great, they just got their start because they read some crazy book and wanted to go somewhere, be rebellious and go off to somewhere else. So here's Boas. He's now got his degree. This is a picture that we have of him in the younger state aboard the Germania, which is the boat that's taking him up to the ship that's taking him up to Baffin Island, way up there. And he started his life out, as you see here, as interested in physics and wavelengths and light and all these things, and interested in something which several of you focused on around page 19 about, how do we perceive reality? What is the difference between the reality out there and our perception of it? Is it the same it's obviously not the same from person to person, but why? What gives us that shape? And in some ways, Boas thought, I think he believed, that if he went way up here into this super harsh environment, that in some ways things would become clearer there. That in such a harsh environment, the people and the customs would all be the same. He began his life as something of an environmental determinist. And there it is, way up there. What a huge place up there in the, I don't know, way north, far away, very cold. I guess I was also struck by they get there and it takes them another 6 weeks to actually get to the island, which, I don't know about you, but I get a little bit nervous if it takes me like 20 minutes to get an extra place. But 6 weeks sitting on a ship off the coast of this island before you actually dock there would be unbearable. But there he is up there, and a bunch of things happen, and he does a bunch of things with the Inuit. But he eventually comes to realize or to come to a very different conclusion, perhaps, than what he started with. And he uses this German word, and the Germans are always famous for having these multisyllabic words that have very specific meanings. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that in German, but in this case, the training of one's heart to see the humanity of another. And so, in some ways, Boas goes off thinking that the people are going to be all the same and wondering what they're going to be like and not knowing much at all, and begins by having to depend upon them for his survival and depend upon them for understanding this world, to begin to comprehend their lives in a different way. So developing an appreciation for their skills. There's a very kind of famous passage there on pages 28 to 29, when he's still just writing in letters to, this time to Marie, about why do we look down on other people who are often better than we are at being hospitable and understanding the social situation of knowledge, that his own training as a university doctor, professor, was no good. It didn't work up there. And that being smart was in part conditioned by the environment in which you were, or I should say was conditioned by the environment in which you were. So then he's up there, does his thing, and then he actually comes to the United States for the first time and heads down to this place, what was starting to be this place. Actually find out a little. Has anybody been to the Smithsonian? There are some Smithsonian people. We find out, Francis, what happened here? What had this start? Did not know that. Yeah, we have a whole person. This is named after. His name was Smithson. And he gave some money, and then Congress fought and fought about how to spend the money. And they finally came up with these goofy looking buildings and put some stuff in there. But it was a pretty big project. Actually, this kind of reminds me of the story of Hartwick College, by the way, which is you had John Christopher Hartwick, who acquired some land. He took it. Yeah, it was, he took some land, he acquired some land, and then he dies. And I was told by Professor David Anthony that he left his money to Jesus Christ. And so they didn't know what to do with this. And so they fought, and the lawyers brought in, and they finally well, I guess we'll establish a seminary. I mean, I guess that's what Jesus would want, I can't. So that's how eventually we got Hartwick College here. But we have this institution being created. I was looking around for pictures of the Smithsonian, and I chanced upon this article as well, which is, they haven't been able to prove that it was the labor of enslaved persons that actually brought in the first stones to build the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., but it's probably people who were enslaved from the quarries who brought in some of those first stones to do this. And I put this out there just because we have this juxtaposition in this country already from the beginning of these high ideals of knowledge, science, progress. We're going to build this great building dependent upon the structuring of the society, which was very unequally structured by race. So, picking too much on Francis here, but Francis at the end asked, why is Boas considered the father of American anthropology? Because if you look at the very end here, you have Boas going back to Germany. He's like, nobody's hiring him. The Smithsonian turns him down. He's just got some field notes. He doesn't speak English very well. He can't get married. Marriage postponed. He's setting off for 1885 on the return journey across the Atlantic, going back to Germany. And he says his only consolation was that his English had improved enough for him to be able to name how he felt. It was a state of mind that he had learned from Marie to call the blues. He's got the blues. Well, you have to wonder where he picked that term up. Where was he hanging around to get that term from? But he's got the blues and he goes back to Germany. And it struck me here, this is a potential essay topic for you to be thinking about when you write your first essay. So I'm just putting it out there for you to take notes of if you want to do this project. Let's say that Boas never came back from Germany. Let's say he just stayed over there because he couldn't get a job here. And let's say that this guy, Lewis Henry Morgan, who we learned about a little bit, he was the author of a book called Ancient Society, or Researches in the Lines of Progress from Savagery through Barbarism to Civilization, dominates US Anthropology instead of Boas, right? So I'm struck by here, what would be different? What would be different in the way we taught anthropology if it didn't come from the Boasian circle, if Boas had just stayed away? And we got all of our stuff from Lewis Henry Morgan, who has been important in academic circles, and this book was widely read, and a lot of people agreed with him. The Line of Progress, from savagery through barbarism to civilization. What would your classes be like? Would US society be any different? I'm not sure about that last one. I think anthropology might. I'm not sure about the last one. So again, we will eventually find out that Boas comes back and becomes the father of American anthropology and trains all these people and develops and becomes very famous and fights against these ideas of Lewis Henry Morgan. But this is the context of the time. This is what we talked about. The greatest moral battle. Is humanity one thing? Are we all in some ways equally part of this human thing? Or can we rank people and decide who's better and who's worse and who should be part of the human story?